The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
I'm your host, Justin Soder. This evening, as always, I have the privilege of sharing the company of Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio, and the author of the book Work of Human Hands, the subject of our show this evening. Father, thanks for joining us again.
Happy to be here as usual.
Well, Father, this is our third program here on the season series Work of Human Hands, and the two previous shows we have talked about the cast of characters behind the Reform. We've talked about the creation of the new Mass and the long and deliberate effort by many of the key modernists to implement a new Mass. And tonight we're going to talk about the destruction of Latin in the liturgy and why this was so key in ushering in the new religion. We're going to address the history of Latin, its place in the liturgy, why it had to go, and we're also going to address some common objections that arise from time to time about Latin in the liturgy and its place as the official language of the Church in general. So, Father, why don't you start us off here this evening by giving sort of a brief introduction to when Latin was adopted as the official language of the Church and why it was chosen and retained as such?
Well, it was the process of development as the Church spread throughout the world. When you look back at the origins of the Church, you see, of course, the service of the synagogue, of the Palestinian synagogue being part of the being sort of the source initially from which was used in conjunction with the development of Catholic worship. The interesting thing is that in the 1960s, we got the impression that early Christians were really ardent vernacularists, that our Lord himself was in favor of the vernacular, and this should be a motive, as it were, for us changing the Catholic liturgy from Latin to the vernacular. However, in fact, the language of the synagogue service, where our blessed Lord himself read from Holy Scripture, according to the Gospels, we find out that the language of that, was, except for sermons, really was Hebrew. And Hebrew at the time of our Lord was not a vernacular language. It was sort of the equivalent of Latin now. So one historian made the point that if vernacular and absolute intelligibility had been an integral part of the Christian religion from the beginning by the design of our blessed Lord, he would have denounced the practice himself. But of course he didn't. He accommodated himself to it and preached, of course, in Aramaic, which was the language of the people. Eventually, as the Church spread throughout the world, especially to the different Jews of the diaspora, the language of Christian worship became the koine, which was koine means common, the common Greek that was spoken around the Mediterranean. So you had that element, the use of koine, so you would have this element of intelligibility, and so that people would understand, but the changes came very slowly. Eventually, as Latin replaced Greek as the language of the Christian world, eventually Latin started to be used in the Sacred Liturgy. However, there was actually a long period of this shift from Greek, from the Koine Greek to Latin, to the common language, for a number of reasons, one of which scholars said was the tendency in liturgy to respect tradition and to have a reverence for the past. The scholars tell us that Latin was finally introduced into what we would now call the canon of the Mass toward the end of the 4th century. So it actually took a while. There was the period, though, in which the Mass continued to be celebrated for Latin speakers in Greek. So it was a long period of shifting. And by the 4th century, though, it became the language of the Mass in the West. And it continued there at that point, with very few exceptions, right up until the Second Vatican Council.
I remember in my days in the Novus Ordo, Father, when I first started getting the idea that, hey, I sort of like this whole Latin Mass thing. When I would speak about it with people, and I would mention how beautiful Latin is, they would say things like, well, you're just being a linguistic supremacist. Our Lord spoke Aramaic, so if we wanted to be accurate about this, we should, the Mass should be in Aramaic. So now that's sort of a canard there, but I think it's worth talking about. Why is that important to sort of debunk that myth that we should go back to the language that our Lord spoke?
Well, fine for instruction. If they want to speak Aramaic in the Novus Ordo for instruction, certainly it would be better than some of their translations. But the idea, there's a theological idea behind the shift, and you always with the liturgical changes, the argument in the 60s was that we're going to return to a primitive tradition, Christian tradition, just like it was, when our Lord walked the earth and during the first days of the apostles. So it's important to realize that certainly when it comes to the vernacular, as with just about everything else they said about the liturgical changes, that it's a lot of baloney.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, go ahead, Father. In fact, this principle of absolute intelligibility is a modern idea. Mm-hmm. So when exactly, Father, did the efforts begin to sort of we've talked a lot about in the previous 2 episodes about these creeping modernists and how they were patient and they were very thorough with their plan, but they were patient and slow about it. When did the efforts actually begin to introduce the vernacular into the Latin liturgy?
Well, if you talk about after the Protestant revolt, eventually I suppose we'll get around to their theological ideas for that. But in the 20th century, the left wing of what we've been talking about in previous shows, the liturgical movement, the left wing of that started to promote the idea that the liturgy, Catholic liturgy, should go for the most part into the vernacular. And the origin for that particular idea, what it was is it was sold and pushed on the basis of essentially this idea of intelligibility in liturgy, that the big guns of the liturgical movement had this idea that the whole spirit of the Catholic liturgy was lost, maybe around the year 400. And intelligibility for the people was lost, and you had to regain that. And that, secondly, the idea was that, you have to use the liturgy for pastoral reasons as a means of instruction for the people. So obviously, it has to be in an intelligible vernacular. So you had the push for that in the 30s and 40s, and especially after the war. And you see this pickup of momentum on it, where in the International Congress of the Liturgical Conference, or of the Liturgical Movement in, I believe, in Lugano, in Italy in the 50s, the Jungmann, who was one of the big guns of the liturgical movement, gave this speech and talked about how that Latin was like it was a fog curtain preventing people from understanding the liturgy. And that, of course, became a rallying cry, and it appeared even in this idea in Montini's when Cardinal Montini, later Paul VI, when he wrote a pastoral letter to the people of Milan on the Sacred Liturgy, he spoke about this curtain that was preventing understanding. So there's this development from the 30s onward on the left wing of the liturgical movement.
Okay. Well, before we get into the real meat of the matter here of this episode, Father, I want to address a couple of things. I want to address a thought that's common amongst trads today that I've heard over the years, and I also want to talk about an argument before we actually talk about the Latin itself. One of the things I've heard several times over the years in the traditional movement is the thought that, well, if the Mass had just been translated directly into the vernacular from the Latin and the prayers left unaltered, this would have been okay. This would have been acceptable. Why, Father, is this a flawed assertion? I mean, wouldn't that have been a good compromise?
Well, that was a sort of a 60s and 70s idea, and I remember hearing that myself, people saying that, well, if you had given it a sufficiently sacred type of translation, there would have been nothing wrong with it. But you have to remember that the basis for the shift to the vernacular was essentially a theological shift, trying to make the liturgy man-centered and trying to turn it into an instruction session. So that was behind it, and it brought with it all of the disadvantages, as it were, or rather caused the liturgy to lose many of the aspects of its sacred character and the very reasons why Latin was retained. So it was more than just a question of putting it into a comprehensible language. It was the whole load of theological baggage that went along with it.
I want to address an argument here, and this is also one that comes up quite often. But Father, didn't the Roman Church allow the Mass to be said in other tongues in history? If the early Christians didn't use Latin, why do you act like it's such a big deal? The Church has allowed this, so why wouldn't it allow English?
Well, historically there were certain exceptions that the Church did occasionally allow the celebration of the Roman Rite in form of or in a language other than Latin, but the Church never actually allowed it in anything. I think maybe with just one or two exceptions in a few local areas, with anything that really resembled the vernacular. That the language always had to be the language of translations had preferably to be a classical version of the language, a literary version of the language. And in most of those cases, that did not render it intelligible to most of the people. So where it was done, it certainly was not done in the way that the modern translations were done. So it's apples and oranges on that point. Well,
so now we get into the question about why we actually use Latin. And you write in your book in chapter 4, you describe Latin as a, quote, living link to the past, a sign for continuity and fidelity to tradition, unquote, obviously speaking about the Church. And you list 5 reasons here, and I'd like you to maybe just spend a couple of minutes going over these. You list the reasons why we use Latin as stability, safeguarding doctrine, tradition, unity, and sacredness. Could you comment a little bit on those, Father?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, stability, the idea is that the meaning of words in Latin does not really change because it's a language that's not a spoken language, and a spoken vernacular is more subject to changes of shift and of meaning. And, we see that happen in English all the time. That in the 50s when I was growing up, that pot meant one thing, and that was something that, you cooked soup in. And when you got to the 60s, it was something entirely different. So too with the word gay. I mean, all that meant was happy through the middle and middle 60s, but then it came to connote something else. So you have there's this stability, and this stability in and of itself is something that connects you, as it were, with the past, and so that's a very important feature of it. As far as one of the other characteristics of the unity,
safeguarding doctrine, unity.
Yeah, it was that this language was stable, and it maintained as it were, the visible unity of the church throughout the world. There's absolutely no question about that. That no matter where you went, the Sacred Liturgy was celebrated in Latin, and that was that. And those who were opposed to Latin denigrated that as the tourist argument. But actually, it's something that's very important because it's a sign of unity in worship and a sign of unity in doctrine as well. And then on the point that you mentioned about safeguarding doctrine, you get the link of Latin in the liturgy is to different doctrinal truths. And again, you have stability the way these expressions are used. Once you get into the vernacular, you can manipulate, as it were, the translation sometime, and lose the meaning of different doctrinal truths. So that's something that is in fact very, very important. One of the things that you noticed in the 60s is that no one wrote theology in Latin anymore. And the reason no one wrote theology in Latin anymore is because the meanings of terminology, terms in Latin, theological terms, were very fixed and very stable. And you couldn't get away with the same slipperiness in Latin that you could get away with in the vernacular, where the meaning of something is like trying to nail Jello to the wall. So there was that element. It was that recommended it, but also the tradition of the church. We talked about the natural conservatism of when it comes to religious forms. You had, if you talk about language, that the priests celebrating in Latin at the altar uses prayers that come, many of them from, say, the time of St. Augustine, and he used the same prayers. So it's this link with the past. And two, then you have the aspect of sacredness of it, that it's something that it's apart from daily life. So it gives you the clear understanding that what you are doing at Mass is something sacred and special. So that's that's sort of the overview of this.
And if there's anything that we can all say about the Novus Ordo, is that there's not one unifying thing about it. Every Novus Ordo that you possibly can find in your area, each one of them is going to be different. There is no unity in that.
Yes, and of course that's the point. And that would only be possible if you had, in addition to all the other loosey-goosey rules they have in the Novus Ordo, that was only possible if you had the vernacular. I mean, Father Chuck down at St. Teilhard's down the street, I mean, he couldn't, greet you on, Red's opening day with some spontaneous comments and a couple of jokes, about who is going to win the day's game and go Reds, if he's forced to improvise in Latin.
Something you talk about, too, in this chapter, Father, and I think this is important to hit home on this point as well, is that you say that whenever Latin was dumped for the vernacular in the past, this always pointed to heresy and corruption. And perhaps you could speak a little bit about that, just briefly.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the story of the so-called Protestant Reformation when it came to the liturgy, that the Protestants viewed the liturgy as something intended primarily to instruct men. Okay, so and to stir up this nice warm salvation feeling that you're supposed to get. So how can you do that? Well, you can't do that with Latin. You have to get to the common man by using the vernacular. Okay, so that's one point that's extremely important. That you use this to spread your false doctrine, to give men this so-called salvation experience. You do this to break with tradition. You do this to try to make the false claim, of course, that this returns us to early Christian tradition. And then you get to manipulate the translations. I mean, this is historically, you find that even in the time of Tertullian, the time of the Fathers, that you find people manipulating the translations. And this is something that Luther did when he translated the Bible, to downgrade the idea of sacrificing priesthood, to remove the notion of the sinlessness of Blessed Mother. So it's the translations can be manipulated and used as an engine to promote error. So that's the advantage, as it were, to heretics of the use of the vernacular. You can make doctrines disappear.
You also describe in this chapter about Latin being a locked-in language, which I think you've eloquently laid out here in this first part of the show. Is it fair to say that the driving motive behind getting vernacular into the liturgy was for ecumenism?
That was part of it. And but it was the double-barrel approach of modernism and ecumenism. But I think primarily it was the modernist conception of the liturgy, and that sort of the add-on for that was ecumenism, because all of our separated brethren, they all used the vernacular as well, and now we were going to get closer to them by becoming just like them.
For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and I'm joined this evening by Father Anthony Cekada. The title of the show is Lost in Translation, so we're talking about the removal of Latin from the liturgy and all the forces and ideals that work to make that happen. We want to remind you that Work of Human Hands is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can usually be very easily obtained by writing to us at mail@truerestoration.org. If you are listening to our show on iTunes or Stitcher, please make sure to leave us ratings and reviews. This helps those who are looking for truly Catholic programming to more easily find our work. So, Father, moving into part two here of this, we want to talk a little bit about the document Sacrosanctum Concilium. Now, this is a document that I have had a very difficult time reading over the years because of some of the language that it uses, and you certainly see the hatred that some had in this for the old Mass, and it's a little bit difficult for me to stomach even after all these years of having read it. So I was hoping maybe you could give our listeners maybe like a 30,000-foot view of this document, its language as it specifically relates to the future of Latin as far as liturgical matters are concerned.
Okay, well, again, so people are reminded of it. This is Sacrosanctum Concilium. It was also called the Constitution of Sacred Liturgy. It was the first document that the Second Vatican Council passed. It was written by Annibale Bugnini, who was, as we mentioned, was one of the prime movers and engineers of some of the pre-Vatican II liturgical changes. So to get the document passed, it had to be written in such a way that it would appeal to and deceive those of the Council Fathers, those of the bishops, who were against who were actually in favor of retaining the traditions of the church and who would have been shocked by too radical a change, and yet it had to leave the opening for some sort of legal opening for instituting the changes that the modernists wanted. So you have this on one hand, on the other type of language in Sacrosanctum Concilium. So you ended up with, as it were, lots of weasel words and contradictory phrases that, on one hand, would placate the fathers who were not enthusiastic about too much radical change, and then at the same time allow that opening.
This document uses explicitly unclear language. You talked about the weasel words, and some of those words that you hear, like Latin should have a quote unquote pride of place and quote unquote should be kept. I mean, you can go through this document and find all kinds of language like that. These weasel words, I believe, I think it's fair to say, they serve as a mechanism of action for almost all the abuses we know today. And this type of language has continued on throughout the years, where, I mean, it essentially defines nothing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how those weasel words do serve as the mechanism of action for all these horrors that we see today, but also how this is the language that the modernists use.
Well, they Pius X pointed out in Pascendi, they are able very cleverly to use the contradiction to sound Catholic on one page and total rationalists on the next page. So what you get is, in addition to pride of place, the Latin should be kept. So you get that on one hand. Then on the other, you get, you have to give a suitable place to the mother tongue. Okay, in parts of the Mass, in the vernacular, it can be of great advantage to the people. So you put something like that in another paragraph, and then you talk somewhere else about, we may need, an even more radical adaptation of translations in the liturgy. This may be desirable. So what you have is all of this, you have the groundwork essentially laid. And the document is one that the meaning, its meaning has been disputed between what we could call conservatives and progressive modernists ever since it came out. But that's how it was designed. So it was the wedge for the destruction of Latin.
Well, branching out of this, out of this statement here, there's another train of thought that I've heard throughout the years, and that was, and of course this is coming from those who call themselves traditionalists, is that the vernacular was only permitted, that it was never imposed. I hope maybe you could clarify that point, that it certainly was imposed.
Well, if you look at the language of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, it gives you the opening to impose it, and then who is given the authority to impose it? Well, the bishops' conferences were given authority in liturgical matters, and you can bet they imposed it. That's exactly what happened, and the document itself gave them the power to do that, and they made the decisions. That's one of those things that you constantly hear about, the misinterpretation of Vatican II, and what the fathers intended was really betrayed. Well, I mean, who were these rascally guys who implemented Vatican II? Well, it was the bishops who passed the documents when they were in Rome and came home to the dioceses and implemented them. So presumably they knew exactly what they were doing.
Right. So we're not talking about permission. We're talking about true imposition here.
Yeah, the bishops were given the power to be our new legislators by Vatican II when it comes to liturgical matters. They were given the power, in fact, in later documents, to decide the date on which the Novus Ordo would be imposed in different countries, when new translations would become obligatory, and so on. So this is the express will of the council. So it's sort of a fantasy to say that these rascally people who misinterpreted Vatican II and who distorted what the fathers of Vatican II wanted. The fathers knew what they wanted.
Yeah, there's something else too, and this is one that I hear a lot of, and I'm sure you have throughout the years as well, is that people tend to want to judge this based upon their understanding of the language of the liturgy. They'll say things like, "Well, Father, I feel so disconnected with the priest up there whispering and chanting in a language I don't understand." And you make the point in this book, particularly in this chapter, that intelligibility. Well, you say intelligibility is not the standard for liturgical text. So that begs the question, what is the standard? I mean, do I have to understand what's going on up there, or is it not about me? And I think that's kind of, maybe I'm leading you on here, but I think that certainly begs the question.
No, that gets us to a very important issue, that when you say intelligibility, first of all, the traditional Mass is quite intelligible, but it's not. You don't have to understand each and every word and each and every grammatical expression and construction for you to have a true understanding of it. People, this idea of the intellectual comprehension of every word it's not the point of the Mass. The idea is that we're supposed to pray, become united to the Church, and lift up our hearts and minds to Almighty God. And so we can do that, and I think there are 10 different ways that you can participate, as it were, in a Mass that's celebrated in Latin. You're going to be a member of the choir and sing part of it. You can follow certain of the text or all of the text in your missal if you want. You can meditate on the Passion when you're looking at the altar. You can recite the Holy Rosary. You can follow a book of meditations on the different points of the Mass. There are a whole bunch of things that you can do, and each of those you understand it in the sense that you know what's going on, and you're uniting yourself to that. So it's not just this dry intellectual translation exercise.
Well, your answer there, it points to a conversation I had the other day with someone who attends the Novus Ordo, and their objection was, I want to pray to God in my own language. Well, to that I would say you can. It's called a missal.
Sure.
You don't. Yeah. It has nothing to do with you and the priest. Has if you want to pray in your own language, then read the missal. And I think that's a disconnected argument.
Well, it is. And the thing is that you look at something like this. When I was a kid, we sang High Mass every day. We knew what was going on. We knew what the Gloria in Excelsis meant. We knew what the Pater Noster meant. I knew that in fourth grade. And we were belting out all these Latin chants, and we understood. We didn't understand, the Latin grammar, but we knew what was going on.
Exactly. So some of the objections as well to this, and I'm sure you've heard this over the years, people will always point to the Eastern rites. They'll say, well, Father, the Eastern rites, they always use the vernacular. Shouldn't this be an example for us that it can work? Well, doesn't this crack your theory, Father, that the language of the liturgy shouldn't change?
The thing is, though, the Eastern rites, this was not, I think we might have mentioned this, universal intelligibility. People didn't. If you have the liturgy in Church Slavonic, you don't speak Church Slavonic in everyday language, or you don't in say like classical Armenian. I think it's the Mectrus in Vienna. It's in classical Armenian. You didn't. I don't think you could. Whatever Armenians do, sell rugs or something in classical Armenian, because people wouldn't understand what you're talking about. So it's incorrect to say that all of these Eastern rites had absolute intelligibility anyway. And
it's not really the vernacular.
Tradition and development was different in any case. And hey, the thing is that how many Novus Ordo types would sit through a liturgy, the length and complexity of one of the Eastern Rite masses, the Divine Liturgy. Very few, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the fuel, as it were, of actually taking the Latin out of the liturgy. And let's talk about the Concilium a little bit here. They issued documents in 1964, 65, and 67, and they began to move away from slavish translations of the Latin originals to a more free-form adaptation. And of course, we certainly hear this today with, Eisel's translations to free-form this and free-form that. It's a kind of go where the Spirit takes you sort of thing, and that's what you get, today. Can you talk a little bit about this progressive freedom of these documents?
Yeah, it was a very interesting thing to see when I did the research for Work of Human Hands, that you could see a gradual loosening of any idea of a literal, we could say, or let's say an accurate translation of what was going on in the Latin. And you would the reason I say it was intriguing was because it got to a certain point where, even as a high school seminarian, I knew that something that was presented as an official translation was really goofy. And then, it didn't really have anything. It was a distortion of actually what was in the Latin. So the source of this was actually documents from Concilium that gradually let up on the idea that you had to have real translation. So you get, language like, well, there can be a certain adaptation in translations, okay? Or that, you should render faithfully this text, but then on the other hand, you shouldn't be too slavish when it comes to exaggerated classical forms, okay? So that was another thing that he said. And so what happens is it's like Vatican II again, that you're getting these intentionally contradictory bits of legislation. And the idea is that this is a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the people in the National Liturgical Conference bureaucracies throughout the world, that you can basically do what you want with the translations. So you get over a period of a couple of years these documents that loosen things up, that allow you to adapt. You get the commentators who are writing about this, who are on the Roman commissions, talking about how you should adapt translations. And then finally you get a document from Rome itself that basically says that you can make free-form adaptations of what appears in the Latin. And that's exactly what happened. In so many, in French, in German, and maybe not so much in Italian, but certainly in English.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now, for those of our French listeners, I'm going to butcher this, so I'm going certainly to allow Father to correct my poor French.
Oh, the French are very forgiving with mispronunciations of their language,
especially by Americans. Especially by Americans. All right, so at the center of all of this is Comme le Prévoit of 1969. And correct my pronunciation if I'm wrong, but tell us about that as well, Father, because I think this is a keynote to speak about here.
This was sort of the death blow to accuracy, and this is what produced the whole mess that followed that everyone complained about, Comme le Prévoit. And it was an instruction written in French that talked about adapting your translation. So they say, for instance, the accuracy and value of a translation can only be assessed in terms of the purpose of the communication. So you have to look at the total context when you translate. It's not sufficient to translate a formula verbatim. So it has to become a genuine prayer of the people. So you get all of this loosey-goosey language, and then they tell you how to, they say, well, you can amplify the text a little or paraphrase. And then they give you a list of Latin terms that they, in effect, forbid you to translate correctly. So pius and pietas, pious and piety. You can't translate it that way. Or salus, it may mean salvation in a theological sense, or it can also be translated as health or well-being. Okay, I'm going to offer prayers, for your eternal well-being. Okay, I guess that's how you do it. Or then superlative adjectives like most blessed or most glorious, those things can be ditched. So there are a whole load of things like this that were allowed to be manipulated in translation. So this document was licensed, and then it was this that produced all of these awful, crazy translations. In English, let's say in particular, there are so many things that were particularly bad. One of the things in preparing the book that I looked at was the Latin Novus Ordo Missal, and I looked at how the collects were translated from the Latin into the vernacular using this new translation method. And if the Latin Novus Ordo was bad enough, but the translators, on the basis of this instruction, made it even worse. For instance, what are called the collects and prayers over the gifts and post-communion prayers for the Sundays in ordinary time. That's the equivalent in the traditional Mass of our time after Pentecost. The word gratia in Latin, which means grace, appeared 11 times. Not once was it translated in English. So you have, talk about a loss of grace. I mean,
really?
That was it. It simply disappeared. This is the sort of thing that Bugnini actually talked about in one of his speeches, where he said that in translation, the liturgy undergoes a further change and a further enculturation. And that's what they did. They pulled out concepts like this.
And that would be called sort of like the negative theology, right?
Well, the idea of grace would disappear because it's and replaced with stuff like favor, which is actually just what Luther did to the Hail Mary, by the way. But because grace connotes the idea of a supernatural order that is separate from the natural order. And the modernists don't like that idea too much of a supernatural order. Thank you. That they're immanentists, and that everything basically has to take place here. So we have to make the concepts, the different concepts that are tied in traditionally with a supernatural order, disappear. So goodbye grace.
Mm-hmm. All right. I was referring more to you write in 1970 that negative theology was removed to appease the Protestants, and so I'm assuming that this is sort of the manifestation of that.
Well, yeah. Also, you had some elements still of negative theology that continued to exist in a few places in the Latin version of the Novus Ordo, and these then could be made to disappear as well in the vernacular translations. So this went.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who are just joining us, we are reaching the end of tonight's broadcast, but before we do, I'd like to remind you that you're listening to Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and this evening I'm being joined by Father Anthony Cekada, the author of the book Work of Human Hands. And tonight we have been talking about the removal of Latin, the history of Latin, but the removal of Latin from the Mass and all the modernist tactics used to do so. But before we wind up this program, Father, but hit one more point here, and I think if anybody has logged on and watched your interviews that are available online, they will be very familiar with this argument. And many people will try to defend Paul VI in his views on Latin and say, well, if the Pope only knew, and I remember watching an interview, I think it was when you were talking about your seminary days, that you even fell into that, saying, well, if the Pope only knew, and this is a real favorite worn out war horse, I guess, for those who are either confused or in denial about the nature of who these men were. We hear that constantly, even to this very day. And I think, Father, it only plays second fiddle to, well, what the Holy Father really meant was. So let's go ahead and dispel this nonsense now. This is a load of nonsense. And the fact of the matter is the Pope, quote unquote, did know. Just like JP2 knew, Benedict XVI knew, Mr. Bergoglio knows, and I think this kind of harkens to what Bishop Sanborn says all the time: is these men are not stupid. I mean, they were raised. Well, he might argue that in the case of Bergoglio, but these men were raised in Catholic households. They knew what the Church taught. So let's talk about this for a minute. If only the Pope knew, Father.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, you have to. This was the refrain that you would hear in The Wanderer, and that I'd said myself so many times. You'd find complaints about this in say, like Triumph magazine and so on. However, when you actually look at the evidence, a different picture emerges. That you look at what Paul VI said. Even before Vatican II, about the vernacular and how the rights of the Church were an obstacle. You had to have intelligibility, and that finally, his statements, even after his election, were in favor of removing this dark cloud, this dark curtain. Making the liturgy intelligible. So that's what you're working with. When it comes to these translations, the common complaint was that, the Pope, he doesn't really understand English all that well. He doesn't know how the Latin is being distorted in the translation. There are different studies that were published to show how terrible these translations were, that how they misrepresent what was in the Latin original, let's say, of the Novus Ordo when it was brought over in English. But then the interesting thing that I discovered in the course of researching human hands was in the book La Riforma Liturgica by Annibale Bugnini, who talked about virtually every aspect of the liturgical reform, and he talked about this document on translations, Comme le Prévoit. And he actually was, of course, quite proud of this, the vernacular translations, and he gave the whole story of how this document came about and who wrote it. And, lo and behold, it turns out that the text constantly went back and forth between the authors of this document and Paul VI. So Paul VI was involved at every point for the production of the Comme le Prévoit, this document that produced all these terrible translations, and he even corrected the page proofs himself. And there's something, I think Bonini says something like 69 corrections that on the final version that Paul VI himself initialed personally. And he wrote in Italian in the end that something like, it's a little bit long, this Comme le Prévoit, but, I think it will serve well, and so it's approved. And then he dated it. He approved it at every step. And he understood what was being created and approved even the final page proofs of it. So there's no question that Paul VI didn't know. He was involved. They would always say in Germany, "Oh, if the Führer had only known." Well, in this case, also the Fuhrer, Paul VI, knew, and he approved of it. He signed off.
Mm-hmm. Which is called taking ownership.
So I think so.
Yeah, I would
although
say
he had some socialist tendencies, so I don't know what he actually would say about ownership. So the people who complain, like Michael Davies, I remember him yammering on about that you can't get the real Mass of Paul VI, in the English translation. Well, sorry. The real Mass of Paul VI was what you would consider the mistranslated version, because he approved all the principles.
Right. I heard those similar arguments as well. And, and while we're talking about the Pope not knowing, that argument, the Pope not knowing, there was a comment on Paul VI's statement about Latin itself. And Paul VI described Latin as a, quote, thick curtain which closes the church off from men, women, children, and everyday affairs, unquote. So, what does that tell you about what the Pope really knew about the Latin being taken out? I mean, I think that's sort of, the final nail in the coffin right there for the people who think that he didn't know.
Precisely, and you see that consistently. It's thank heaven, because of modern technology and information technology especially, it's a lot easier to find out now what actually went on than it was when we were going through all these changes. But all of this, as it were, has come out in the wash, and so there's so many things that this is something that his attitude is something that was undeniable.
This kind of goes back to our first couple of programs, and I think I asked you at the time, I thought, why weren't people standing up about these things that were coming out of Rome? And me being my age, in my early 30s, I take for granted just what you were talking about having access to the internet and literally being able to scan everything that comes out day by day. Whereas 50 years ago, that was unthought of. I mean, no one would have been able to do that. So I think for someone my age, I don't fully appreciate the communications barrier that was there for people not to be able to know what exactly was going on until it showed up at their parishes.
Yes, and the other consideration there is that there was this wave of legislation, and so many things were happening, it was hard to keep things straight. So you had this massive shift in the Catholic liturgy, all of these documents coming out from Rome and national bishops' conferences, and this commission and that commission, and it was something that was overwhelming, even if you could get the whole, if you could have gotten all the material, if you were on, say the mailing list, even if you were a bureaucrat in Washington in the bishops' conference, keeping track of it would have been really something. If you look at there's a resource book called the DOL, Documents on the Liturgy, which was prepared by the monks of I think the monks of Salem did it. And it's this absolutely massive volume that gives you all of these documents that came out as a part of the official liturgical reform. And to figure out what was going on there, still less to get to the bottom of the story and find out who produced these changes and what their motives were and their ideas were. That's something that would have been impossible. But now, thank heaven, the story is coming out, and we do have this information.
All right. So to put a timeline on this, by 1968, Latin was gone. And I think it's also safe to say that playing on the words of these documents, the suitable place for the vernacular, as they would say, the suitable place for the vernacular, meant anywhere Latin appeared virtually.
Yeah, you didn't have, no one used Latin anymore in the parishes. It was gone. And the idea that a choir, since I was involved in church music, I knew this, that the idea that a choir would put a motet sing a motetta in Latin on Sunday was inconceivable. Everything was supposed to be in the vernacular. You would find now and then, and I tried to find them myself, a parish that would use, let's say, at least some of the old Latin music, but it disappeared. It was done in by the Second Vatican Council. No one did the music. No one did the old or new Mass in Latin. It was considered old church. That was over. That was pre-Vatican II. Now it's the people of God. And we have this principle of absolute intelligibility. So it was this dramatic shift in just a couple of years, that by the time you got to 68, Latin had gone. And if you proposed that you have anything in the liturgy in Latin, you would be looked at as if you're crazy. I was thinking about this as I was going over the Victimae Pascali Laudes, which is the sequence that's sung on Easter with our choir, that I remember having, in effect, to fight with the priests at the parish where I was organist to use this one Latin piece on Easter. One of the most famous pieces of liturgical music and poetry in existence. And, they didn't want to go for it. And so I had to dig my heels in and fight with them, and eventually I got it. But, you were basically regarded as crazy or a crank. The modernists really did a job on it. They marched right in and were triumphant on the question of language by 1968, even before the new Mass itself was in place.
So to put a concluding paragraph here on this whole thing, I think it's important to emphasize to our listeners 2 points as we close this program out here this evening, is that it was Paul VI and not some ghostly bad translator who doesn't have a face or a name who owns the bad translation of an already bad liturgy, so-called. Also the fact that these so-called mistranslations, they are indeed the Novus Ordo Mass. They're not mistranslations, but they are the intended result by Paul VI.
And indeed, that is true. It was one package that was sold at first in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and then was confirmed by the subsequent Roman decrees that in effect promoted distorted translations, and finally Comme le Prévoit, which was the final shot to the head with the Luger, that killed off any notion of accuracy in translation. And it's all the responsibility of the Führer, who knew about it at every point, all the responsibility of Paul VI.
Well, Father, that's going to wrap it up here for this show. We're going to be back next month to discuss Chapter 5, the Mass as an Assembly. Before we let you go, and hoping you have a happy Easter, we'd like to find out what's going on over at SGG Resources.
Well, the latest thing that we have at SGG Resources is we have available Easter lily memorials. Our church is very beautifully decorated throughout the Easter season, and these lilies are a part of it, and there's an opportunity to contribute to that. As well, another opportunity at SGG Resources to enroll loved ones in our Easter Mass Novena beginning on Easter. Most of these Masses are high Masses that are chanted throughout the octave of Easter, so you can enroll someone in that. As well, on the blog part of SGG Resources, you'll see a link to some of my latest articles, one on the question of should sedevacantists assist at Masses where the name of Francis of Bergoglio is put into the canon of the Mass. So there's an article there that should be of interest. So as usual, there's always something going on at sggresources.org.
Do you still have the bricks for sale, Father?
The memorial bricks are placed in the walkway of our cloister. We've built a cloister, a monastic cloister walk, and we have memorial bricks with inscriptions that you can get for a small donation to honor someone. And we have a mass said for all of these people who've been enrolled in this once a year. It's quite nice. They're all of these little bricks are lined up going toward the fountain in the center. So that is available as well.
Wonderful. Well, Father, thanks so much for your time, and we will be talking to you at the end of this month on Francis Watch, big episode on the canonization, quote-unquote, of JP2 and John 23, and that should be a very interesting show. So we thank you for your time and look forward to talking to you then. So thanks so much, Father. Have a great night. God bless.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.